Behind me you can see a baobab tree. It's a common tree that you see throughout West Africa. Well, what does that have to do with Islam? Well, I'm in an Islamic republic, but the tree that you see behind me is considered to be sacred. The people worship it, consider that the spirits love it here, the government protects it, you're not allowed to cut it down. Today we're going to be talking about how Muslims live their lives and different sects of Muslims. What do they do for hospitality? How do they pray? What are the differences between the different branches? And one of the things I want you to remember is just because someone is a Muslim, that doesn't mean they believe anything you've ever read in a book about what Islam teaches. Today we're going to learn about the different varieties. I hope you'll enjoy what we're going to be talking about, and remember that differences do exist throughout each of the religions we look at. There's no one form of any faith. Welcome to the third of our 4 lessons on Islam. Today we're going to be talking about Islamic practices and divisions. Before doing today's session, be sure you have printed out the Islamic practices pre-test and filled in your answers. Also, print out the handouts related to Islamic sects. We're going to be looking at those as we go through the video. Once you've had a chance to print all of those documents out, you have them in front of you, you have taken the quiz, you'll be ready to move forward and go on to the next slide and hit start on your video player. So, if you've already completed the quiz, let's go and start looking at the answers. First, Muslims generally do not pay much attention to issues of hospitality. True or false? That is false. Hospitality is a key virtue in Islam. It is essential that we observe their ideas of how to treat a guest if we intend to develop a friendship that will last. When a Muslim crosses the threshold of a home, he will often say Assalamu alaikum, even if he's already greeted the people in the house. If you've met them in the street and you're bringing them into the house, this greeting is intended for the angels who they assume reside in your home. The entryway of a Muslim home would not have any pictures in it, as Muslims feel that angels will not enter a room with pictures of people or animals. They're also offended by dogs. So if you are living your life in a way that is going to make an impact on the Islamic community, you're going to be bringing people into your home. You might want to think through those things, what someone's going to encounter as they come into your house. Once they've come into your home, always offer them water, and then after some time, some tea. In many Islamic cultures, it's considered an intentional insult to have one into your home and not offer them food or drink. At the same time, because of their strict dietary concerns, Muslims may not take any food from you unless you know them well enough and you talk to them and assure them that whatever you're going to serve them is halal. Halal is the word that is used in Islam, similar to the word kosher in Judaism, representing that the food is safe for them to eat. It is considered to be pure. Question number 2, the call to prayer is often one of the first things a Muslim baby hears. That is true. When a child is born into a Muslim family, the adhan, or the call to prayer, is whispered in the right ear, and the ikmat, or the call to establish prayer, is whispered in the left. Children tend to be given a name that honors the prophets, their wives, or their companions. So there are a lot of people with similar names that you're going to run into as you begin to build relationships in Islamic communities. Question number 3, because circumcision is a Jewish custom, Muslims reject it, is false. Male children are circumcised, it's known as khitan, following the example of Nabi Ibrahim, or Abraham as we know him. Muslims consider it as an initiation into the ummah, or the community. Some sects, particularly in Africa, practice female circumcision. And the age of circumcision varies from culture to culture. In some communities it's practiced early on, like the 8th day as it would be in Judaism. In others, it's a sign of entering into manhood at 13. For others, it takes place at different times and at different ages. Question number 4, Muslim families traditionally let their children choose their own mates. That is false. Most Muslim families try to arrange the marriage that they think would be good for their family. In South Asian cultures, and I think this is true in many other Islamic communities as well, cousins are generally the ones to whom a child is wed. If it's a boy child, his mother's brother's daughter is considered to be the ideal mate. The only legal requirement for a Muslim wedding is something called a nikah, which is the signing of the social contract between two families. And this nikah is officiated by a qazi, a judge, rather than by a religious official. So where we might have a priest or a pastor perform a wedding, they actually go to a social judge, indicating that this is a social rather than spiritual union. According to Islamic law, Muslim girls are expected to pay dowry. We hear a lot about how many cows is this girl worth, or what kind of land are you going to get from the father, and we assume that that is an Islamic practice. But actually, it is not. It goes the other way around. Traditionally, the groom's family is to give the bride a price known as the meher, so that she will be well cared for in the event something happens to her husband. Following the wedding, a day or two after the wedding, the groom's family will invite a select group of people to a meal known as a walima. The Quran, you may have heard, allows a man to marry up to 4 wives as long as they're all treated equally. Polygamy among Indian Muslims is rare, only about 2 to 3%. In Indonesia, marrying more than 1 wife is considered to be less than ideal situation, but better than adultery. And so some Muslims practice something called muta, which is a temporary marriage. Many Muslims say this is not allowed. And today it's very common among Muslims, especially educated Western Muslims, to say that there really is no basis for polygamy in Islam, that when the Quran teaches that if you can treat all of your wives equally, you can have up to 4, that's just an impossible standard to say nobody could ever treat 2 people the same, therefore you can't really get married. But those are just some concepts about marriage in Islam. What happens at the end of a marriage? If a man divorces his wife rashly, is it true that he can easily remarry her when he repents? No, it is not. That is false. There are 3 forms of divorce in Islam. Talaq is a husband's unilateral decree that the marriage is over. It must be repeated 3 times and it cannot be undone. So a man just comes in front of his wife and says, talaq, talaq, talaq. I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and the divorce is final. Once a man has given talaq, his wife must remarry and consummate the marriage before the couple could be reunited. So if a man divorces his wife hastily and wants to remarry her, he has to marry her off to someone else, then they have to get a divorce, and then he can marry her again. The second form of divorce is mubarah, a mutual agreement between the bride and the groom to dissolve the marriage. Now, is it okay, is it legal for women to initiate divorce proceedings, or do they have to wait for their husband? It is true that women are allowed to initiate the divorce. That's the third form. We looked at the talaq when the husband does it. We looked at the mubarah when they agree to do it together. And then there is khul when the bride initiates the divorce. And if she does this, then she has to return that money that she received at the wedding, the meher. This almost never happens. It is technically legal, but very difficult in the society for something like this to take place. The kalima, or profession of faith, the confession of faith, La ilallah Muhammad Rasulullah, is often spoken in the ear of a dying person, is true. Although there is great variety in the particulars of Muslim funeral customs between different sects and nations, the following outline is somewhat of a standard. When death is near, a person repeats the kalima and perhaps portions of the Quran in the ear of the person. Family members will offer water and try to comfort the individual. While most prayer times are segregated, men and women pray together at funerals once the person has died, is false. After death, the body is prepared for burial, usually at home. Eyes are shut, the limbs are straightened, and the jaws are closed. The body is given a bath, either at home or in a special facility, wrapped in a new cloth, a kafan, before being taken to the mosque or masjid. Only men can see the body of a man. Only women can see the body of a woman. Even spouses are generally excluded. If women are present at the burial site, they are separate in another place from the men. They don't stand together. Muslims generally cremate their dead. Hopefully you caught that I just gave you the answer to that when I talked about where they bury the body. That is false. Muslims bury their dead. Special prayers, janazah namaz, for the dead are prayed at the masjid or at the homes. They're followed by a burial procession in loud wailing and mourning, and then the burial itself. Generally, Muslims do not use a coffin. The body is tightly wrapped in that cloth, and then the person is buried to the depth of a man's stomach for a man or a man's chest for a woman. The body should be facing Mecca, and each person at the funeral places one handful of dirt on the grave, starting with the imam. The imam is the man who leads the prayers when the community gathers. When everyone has placed a handful, then larger amounts of dirt may be pushed in. Special memorial prayers are offered on the 4th day, the 40th day, the 1-year anniversary after the death, sometimes on the 1000th day. When we lived in Indonesia, our neighbors would occasionally bring us a box of food and say, this is in remembrance of my mother who died 1,000 days ago, or my father who died a year ago. So they would include the community in that morning ritual. The universal brotherhood, or Ummah, is of little importance to the average Muslim. This is false. One of the most significant aspects of Islamic life is the Ummah, or universal brotherhood. Muslims feel a family connection with all other Muslims. They may fight among themselves like brothers often do, but they will work together to protect the Ummah. This is one of the reasons they take conversion to Christianity as such an offense. It is a betrayal of the Ummah. Similarly, evangelization of Muslims is seen as an attack on the Ummah as a whole. So those are just some general things to know about daily life in Islam that would be more or less true across the board. But there are a lot of different divisions within Islam. As a matter of fact, there's an Islamic Proverbs that there are 72 different versions of Islam, and only on Judgment Day will we know which one was correct. The largest branch of Islam are the Sunni Muslims. This term comes from the word sunnah, meaning tradition or way of acting. Sunnis believe that the leadership of the Ummah, or the universal brotherhood of Muslims, should be in the hands of those who closely follow the example of the Prophet Muhammad. Most Muslims, estimated about 85%, are Sunni. The bulk of the information that you have learned about Islam through your entire life, watching the news, reading books, listening to these lectures, the bulk of what you've learned is about Sunni teaching, since they make up so many of the world's Muslims. An outline of the major leaders and schools of law is included in the handout that will kind of walk you through. We've already talked about the rightly guided caliphs and the Umayyad and the Abbasid dynasties, the development of the Sunni schools of law. We talked about some of this through history, but there's a handout for you to print out that looks at who some of these people were. But I do want to take a moment to talk about some reform movements, because they are impacting the world that we live in today. The first one is the Wahhabi, or the Salafi. The Wahhabi reform movement was founded by Ibn al-Wahhad. He died in 1792. This is a puritanical movement that seeks to bring Muslims back to a pure monotheism and away from the Sufi practices that we're going to discuss in a moment. This is the official state-sponsored version of Islam in Saudi Arabia, and it is being exported around the world quite aggressively. It's amazing what has happened in the last 20 years in the Islamic world, as oil money has given Saudi Arabia the ability to send missionaries to Islamic countries around the world and reform from within Islamic societies. Followers of this version of Islam prefer the term Salafi to Wahhabi. The Tablighi Jamaat was founded by Maulana Muhammad Ilyas. He died in 1924. This organization started in India and is now a global missions-minded movement seeking to call Muslims back to right practice and non-Muslims to turn to Islam. It is very much about missions, training people, sending them out on short-term trips, sending them out long-term, very similar to what we think about when we talk about Christian missions. Jamaat-e Islamiyah was founded in 1944 by Abdul Allah Maududi. He died in 1979. This is a socially conservative Islamic political organization in South Asia. So it's similar to Tablighi Jamaat, but Tablighi Jamaat says we want to have religious reform, pretty much along the same lines as the Wahhabi. Jamaat Islamiyah says we want to control the government through political reform to force people to follow these principles that we have developed. This has been going on in South Asia, but the Muslim Brotherhood is almost the same thing, and it has been started in Egypt. Ikhwan al-Muslimin is the name of the Muslim Brotherhood in Arabic. It was founded by Hassan al-Banna in Egypt in the 1920s. It's as I say, very similar to Jamaat Islamiyah. The Taliban are also an organization that has been in the news recently. Taliban is actually the Pashtun word for student, and they started as a student movement seeking to free Afghanistan from Russian occupation in the 1970s and 1980s. They continue to fight for a Afghanistan that becomes an Islamic theocracy. So even though Afghanistan now has its independence and it's an Afghan government run by Afghan people in the Afghan language, allowing them to make their own decisions, all run by Muslims, the Taliban are still trying to make it a theocracy under their control, forcing people to follow their understanding of Islam. Al-Qaeda, which means the foundation or the base, it grew out of the Salafi movement in Saudi Arabia. They are extremists who have carried out terrorist attacks around the world, most famously the attacks on 9/11 in New York, Washington, D.C., and then the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. More recently, there's been a lot of news about ISIS. ISIS is also known as ISIL, is also known as IS, is also known as the Islamic State, is also known as Daesh. Several different names, but it originally was a part of Al-Qaeda, but they became independent as they took advantage of unrest in Syria after the Arab Spring, and they have sought to recreate an Islamic caliphate, to create a one nation of all of the Muslims that used to be united in Islam. They want them to be reunited. They have used terror to advance their cause. They made a huge growth very quickly, but then weren't able to sustain it. But they're continuing to travel all over the world and cause difficulties. All of these reform movements are independent, but share a common vision of a particular version of Islam that they would like to see dominate the entire world. Shiite are the second main branch of Islam. Also, they are known as Shia, which is literally the party or the political party referencing Ali. Ali was the son-in-law of Muhammad, and Shiites believe that there should always be a living representative of the Prophet Muhammad, a living descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, to determine matters of faith and practice. Remember, the Sunni believe it should be somebody who is sharing his character. Shiites believe it's somebody who's sharing his bloodline. Fatima, who was the daughter of Muhammad and Khadija, was also the wife of Ali, who was adopted by Muhammad. She gave several reasons why she thought her husband was the right successor for her father Muhammad. Ali was one of the original recorders of the Quran. He was one of the first, if not the first, male converts to Islam. He was Muhammad's oldest male heir, his cousin, his son-in-law, and his adopted son. He served as a decoy, allowing Muhammad to escape from Mecca. And he was appointed by Muhammad to be the heir. You remember I mentioned earlier that we believe that Muhammad could read and write because on his deathbed he asked for paper and pen so he could write down the name of his successor. And Fatima claimed that he wrote the name Ali. Shiites believe that Muhammad was God's political representative on earth and that his government is equal to God's government. Since Ali was the true successor to Muhammad, Abu Bakr was attempting a coup against God. Because of their strong opposition to Sunni authority and minority status, the Shiites have faced great persecution through the years. As a result, they have developed a doctrine known as taqiyya, which justifies lying in order to protect their lives. Consequently, many Shiites will tell you they are Sunni when they're meeting new people or when they're being polled by the government. Over time, the Shiites divided into a number of sects. The main one are the Ithna Asri, also known as the Twelvers, because they believe that 12 imams followed Muhammad before the last disappeared in a cave in 873. They believe that he is still alive and leading the faithful. Often associated with Iran, the Ithna Asri believe that God still has a visible representative on earth, a legal specialist known as the Ayatollah, the Ayatullah, the Word of God. Other groups of Shia would include the Ismailis, the Bohra, and the Druze. These are all branches from one of the official descendants of Ali. So basically, the Twelvers say Ali's oldest son was Hassan, he was followed by Hussein, whose oldest son was Ali Zain al-Abidin, whose oldest son was Muhammad al-Baqir, and just so on and so forth, until the last one went into a cave and disappeared. All of the other Shiite cults say that the oldest son was not qualified and a younger son was a better choice, and they follow the descendants of the younger son. On the handout, you'll see how they all break out from that main branch. Just a quick word about Muharram. Muharram is a month in the Islamic calendar, and on the 10th of Muharram, Muslims, especially Shiites, remember the death of Muhammad's grandchildren, Ali's sons, Hassan and Hussein, who were killed at the Battle of Karbala. Mattam is a ritual beating of oneself in sympathy for the martyrs, which causes the streets of Shiite communities to literally run with blood. The third main branch of Islam is Sufism, which is both mystical and folk. In one way or another, Sufism influences approximately 70% of all Muslims. So 85% are Sunni, 15% are Shia, and 70% of all of those are also Sufi. This figure is difficult to document because a person who is influenced by Sufism, even a respected teacher who follows the Sufi path, will rarely refer to himself or herself as a Sufi. They see that as a prideful statement. Nevertheless, the majority of Muslims in the subcontinent will look to certain aspects of Sufism for strength or guidance. So, as I mentioned, some are mystical, some are folk. The main goal of mystical Sufism is to find unity with Allah. The desire is to end the distinction between the individual soul and God, and this unity has been described as a piece of metal in a fire. The metal object becomes so surrounded by the heat of the flame that after some time the observer cannot distinguish between the flame and the metal. They're distinct and can be separated, but to the outside observer, the two have become one. No set path for achieving this goal of unity exists. There are certain stages that someone goes through, but there are different practices that can help them find the right path. The first and most important is the Pir-Muridi relationship. A Pir is a leader or a guide. A Murid is a disciple. And so most of what happens in Sufism is oral. It's not written down. The student spends time with the master and learns to follow their instruction. This teaching is very informal. There are spiritual exercises following the master's examples. Some Sufis actually claim writing anything down would rob it of its value. Only a person willing to submit to the process of sitting at the teacher's feet will be able to gain the full value of the lesson. The Pir is available to give instruction to the disciple, give spiritual prescriptions for diseases. This is where some of the folk Islam or animistic Islam comes into play. There are things that they will tie on their arm or wear around their neck called the taviz, which is a short meditation from a verse from the Quran that can be repeated or provide protection. They will write in chalk, wash that in water and drink that, and that gives them power. These pir are often found in dargahs. A dargah is the tomb of a Muslim saint where Muslims come to venerate a dead saint. Although they would say he is not dead, they would say he is still alive and with Allah, and so he becomes an intermediary. The word dargah literally means royal court, and in some places they're also known as mazars or places of visitation. It's the belief of folk Sufis that the saint is in a state of consciousness and they can hear prayer. A Sufi might say, I can see the Pir and the Pir can see Allah. Attendance at the Dargah increases for Urs, U-R-S, which literally means wedding. It's a celebration of the death day of the saint, the day that his soul was wed to Allah. The tomb is cleansed with sandalwood paste and speeches are offered about the great deeds the saint did during his or her lifetime. Surah Al-Fatiha, the first surah or chapter of the Quran, is read, and food and sweets are distributed to the poor. Zikir, or meditation, is another part of the path that most Sufis follow. The process of meditation varies. It's typically a meditative experience that lasts about 2 hours. Individual might take 30 minutes to empty their mind of all worldly cares, and then take about an hour to focus on the name of God or repetitive phrases. The final stage is a 30-minute time of communion with God. The most famous form of this is the whirling dervish. That's what's depicted here in Turkey, where they go into a trance as they spin and spin and spin and spin, thinking and involving their whole body in contemplating God. Qawwali is another way to form that kind of meditation. It's a musical form of meditation. It comes from the Arabic word for one who says, but a qawwali is a type of song that centers on repetition of a phrase or series of phrases about Muhammad or a Muslim saint. This repetition can lead singers or listeners into a trance where they believe they encounter Allah and are united with Him. While music technically is forbidden in Orthodox Islam, Sufis consider qawwali to be exempted because of its spiritual nature. All of these aspects, this master-disciple relationship, special places that are considered to be holy because a dead saint is there, this kind of repetitive meditation and singing of these songs and going into trances, all of this is considered very unorthodox by the Wahhabis and all of the reform movements. This is exactly what they were trying to stamp out. So as you see, there's a lot of variety in Islam. It's not simple to say this is what all Muslims believe, but these are just some of the different kinds of Islam that are out there. As you encounter Muslims, be sure to ask them to tell you what they believe. What are their practices? Why do they do the things that they do? If you have any questions about anything we've covered today, I'd be happy to talk to you in more detail. Give me a call, stop by the office, drop me an email. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know. As always, and God bless. We lived in Indonesia. There was a natural disaster and a mud volcano developed, and so the government paid witch doctors to slaughter goats to cause the volcano to stop. This is just one example of Islam that you will encounter around the world that doesn't match the Islam that you read about in the books. Remember, when you're dealing with people of other faiths, you don't want to assume you know what they believe. You want to ask them questions and let them tell you themselves. Hopefully today's lesson has been eye-opening and will help you as you continue to build relationships with people of other faiths.